Well, what's up again there, guys? Brian here for the Three Topics Gamer, here to share with you another one of my worst best ranking videos. And I have to admit, this particular topic has been something I've wanted to do for a long time, but I just haven't had the courage to come up and do it. And this is going to be a worst to best ranking of all of the games in my legendary 10 out of 10 club. Now, this club is incredibly exclusive because out of the hundreds of games I have played over 25 years of gaming, there are only 14 games that I would deem as completely perfect. I don't need them changed, no matter how many times I play them. My experience is just as wonderful now as it was when I first played them. And that is extremely difficult to do. And the reason why this video is kind of so difficult is simply because I didn't want to try to make it so long. This video could easily have been an hour and a half long to go into every single detail. That's why every single game on this list deserves to be on this list. And I didn't want to do that. And so just trying to script so that I spent like maybe a minute to a minute and a half each on each game was a very difficult task for me to pull off. Now, before I start, you must remember that this list is completely subjective. There's no question in my mind that there are plenty, if not all the games on this list, so many of you are going to look at and be like, you think that's perfect? You'd give that a 10 out of 10? Oh, that game's kind of mediocre. Oh, this game is better. But this list is entirely subjective. Trust me, I understand that. Just like I'm sure there's plenty of games that you play that you would deem perfect that I wouldn't feel that way. This thing doesn't work unless you guys respect that this is just my personal opinion. If you can do that, then I just hope you guys will hopefully respect my list. Because trust me, this list is very difficult to put together, and there's definitely maybe a few entries on here that might surprise you. So, if you do happen to enjoy this video by the end, please make sure you give this video a thumbs up, make sure you subscribe to track me on my future videos, and again, please respect my list, respect my opinions, and without wasting any more time, let's start off with the number 14th entry in my 10 out of 10 club. And one other element I would like to point out. If a game is not on this list, then I would take any game out of these 14 above any of the thousands of games that are on here. So if you see a game, you'd be like, you'd pick that over this game? And my answer to that would be absolutely yes. So without pausing any longer, let's start off with number 14. Taking the number 14 spot on my list has to go to Super Mario 64, which is not only my favorite Mario game of all time, but still remains the last Mario game I've ever beaten. This was also a launch title for the N64 and still remains the best-selling N64 game of all time. If you owned an N64 back in the mid-90s, chances are you owned a copy of this game. Mario is one of the few gaming franchises that manages to make a successful transition between 2D to 3D gaming in its first attempt. In terms of its story, it's just as simple as it's ever been. Princess Peach has been kidnapped by Bowser, and Mario has to go and rescue her. And that's as simple as any Mario game ever needs to be. There are 15 different worlds spread throughout the entire castle that have multiple different missions that you must complete to collect all the stars and have a solid collection of recognizable enemies to defeat. And when it comes to Bowser, though you'll only get to fight him 3 times, each battle strikes the perfect balance of being simple, familiar, yet challenging. There's also a number of special hats that Mario can collect that grant him special powers, and the soundtrack, even after 25 years, still sounds wonderful to listen to. This game is so perfect that when I got the Nintendo Switch, one of the first games I picked up was the Super Mario 3D All-Star Collection, just so I could play Super Mario 64 again. And at the time of this recording, I still haven't even played Sunshine or Galaxy, and have no interest in ever playing those games. Super Mario 64 is so perfect that I have never had any interest in beating any Mario game that has been released after this one, and that puts this title in a supremely elite class of games, which helps it not only be the first perfect video game that I ever played in my life, but still is more than worthy of being on this list. Next on the list goes to Batman Arkham Asylum. Now, up to this point, there have been several good Batman games that I've played, but none of them have really been able to capture every aspect of what it would be like to play as the Dark Knight. The main story has you take Joker back to Arkham Asylum, and shortly after arriving, he quickly breaks out and releases all of the inmates and supervillains across the island, and it's up to you using your skills and collection of gadgets to fix the situation. You will spend your time exploring different areas of the island while having a balanced amount of stealth sections and combat sections, along with multiple varieties of different boss fights that you'll have to deal with. When it comes to the voice acting cast, Bringing in Kevin Conroy and Mark Hamill from the Batman animated series just added to the overall quality that Arkham Asylum brings. And while the follow-ups of the game certainly did manage to improve some aspects of the overall game experience, their attempts to make those games bigger also introduced a series of flaws that were never presented in the first game, which allows Arkham Asylum, more than any other entry in the series, being the only one that really captures the spirit of what exploring Arkham would really feel like. This game did for DC games what Spider-Man 2 did for Marvel games, and this game would go on to inspire multiple games outside of Batman, what helps it become a perfect candidate for this list. Next on my list goes to Devil May Cry 3 Special Edition. After the underwhelming performance of Devil May Cry 2, Capcom made a serious comeback, giving us a prequel to the original Devil May Cry game with the third installment. The story centers around Dante making his way up a demonic tower in order to stop his twin older brother Virgil from recovering the power of their father Sparta, while a demon hunter named Lady, who is also making her way up the tower, is trying to stop her father, who is working alongside Virgil. Not only did this game's main plot do a lot for Dante's character, but it gave us the introduction of Virgil, who is not only my favorite Devil May Cry character in the series, but is a contender for being in my top 5 favorite video game characters of all time. While the original Devil May Cry 3 game was certainly an incredible game, this special edition allowed it to be elevated to perfection, with the addition of new gameplay modes, secret missions, and the ability to play through the entire game as Virgil. This hack-and-slash masterpiece has all the incredible acting you could ask for between its gameplay and cinematic cutscenes, enhanced even more with an awesome soundtrack, providing an experience that never gets old no matter how many times I return to it. The next spot keeps itself in the franchise with Devil May Cry 5 Special Edition, and it's on this list for a lot of the same reasons that Devil May Cry 3 Special Edition is on this list. It did everything Devil May Cry 3 did, just better. The original Devil May Cry 5 game had an incredible story with 3 main characters that you could play as, which each of them having their own exclusive missions that only they could play. The gameplay was fast-paced and well-balanced, with a unique collection of enemies to battle, and with the use of these 3 different characters, each of them felt very unique, providing different styles of combat, and switching between these 3 while going through the missions kept this game not getting repetitive. While the original game was just fine, the Special Edition, just like Devil May Cry 3 Special Edition, gave this title the boost it needed to become the latest entry in this exclusive club, allowing me to play through this entire game as Virgil, who is given a few new exclusive cinematic cutscenes just for him, and the change of the final boss this time around, which adds an additional set of new gameplay modes and difficulties. I think it's safe to say that the Devil May Cry franchise is one of the greatest hack-and-slash franchises ever created, so to have 2 entries on this list really makes this series stand out in an incredible way. Starting off with the top 10, we will have to go to Uncharted 2 Among Thieves. The Uncharted franchise is without question one of the best PlayStation exclusive franchises ever created, and for me, it really hit its peak with the second installment. This time, Drake and his allies are in a race against a dangerous mercenary and his army to reach the lost city of Shambhala and recover the Chintamani stone. It improves on literally every single aspect of the first game. The story is so well told with a great cast of characters, and this game as an action-adventure title is smooth and responsive between its exploration, platforming, and gunplay. There is a great variety of different locations that you will travel to throughout the entire game, with each having spectacular action set pieces that remain iconic to me to this day, with great visuals that still hold up. Now, while Uncharted's 1, 3, and Golden Abyss have multiple problems that hold them back, when it comes to Uncharted's 2 and 4, though the 4th installment certainly is better than 2 in a number of key departments, the singular thing that holds 4 back from being in this club that elevates 2 is the final boss fights. I openly do not like the final boss fight in Uncharted 4, while the final boss in Uncharted 2 is in my opinion the best in the entire series, and is that aspect alone that helps grant Uncharted 2 a place on my list. Taking the number 9 spot on this list has to go to 2015's Rise of the Tomb Raider. Now, as someone who was never a fan of Tomb Raider for the longest time, what I'm about to say might be controversial, but I don't really care. I am a slightly bigger fan of this rebooted Tomb Raider series than I am the Uncharted games. It may be true that I would pick Uncharted 2 over 2013's reboot, but I would pick Rise of the Tomb Raider over Uncharted 2 any day. Now, while the story for the 2013 reboot was a story of survival, Rise of the Tomb Raider really tells the story of Lara becoming the legendary Tomb Raider that she will become, and improves on every single aspect of the 2013 game. Unlike Uncharted, which is very straightforward and linear, Rise of the Tomb Raider is an open-world action-adventure title with better gameplay mechanics with the addition of a strong RPG element that allows me to pour more hours into this game than any other Uncharted game that I've played. It has impressive visuals and a great variety of environments to explore, along with a much larger collection of enemies to face, which includes not only mercenaries, but dangerous wildlife and supernatural enemies as well. Along with having an exciting set of action set pieces and an exciting soundtrack to enhance the experience, if there was one Tomb Raider game that I would recommend to someone who is not yet a fan, it would be this one. Next on my list has to go to my favorite entry in the God of War franchise, which just so happens to be God of War 3. This serves as the conclusion to the Greek mythology era where Kratos is finally making his way up Mount Olympus to kill the remaining gods. Though this entry might seem a bit too straightforward when compared to God of War 4, it's during this game that I believe that the classic hack and slash gameplay style is at its best, and because of that, Kratos as a character feels more powerful in this game than in any other. The visuals, even for a PlayStation 3 game, are still incredible, and this game has not only my favorite collection of weapons and powers that you acquire over the course of the game, but it also has my favorite collection of boss fights in the entire series as a whole. Though Kratos as a character does not have much development at this stage in his story, he really doesn't need it, and remains focused on his singular goal, and the conclusion of this game granted a satisfying ending to this era of the franchise. When God of War 5 is set to release soon, I can only wonder if the second installment in this new era of God of War can reach the same levels of excellence as God of War 3 has. Taking the lucky number 7 spot will have to go to Kingdom Hearts 2. Now, like many sequels have on this list, all this game needed to do was take what worked in the first game and improve upon it, and Kingdom Hearts 2 managed to do that in layers. When it comes to its story, Kingdom Hearts 2 hits that perfect balance of not being so simple as the first game was to the point where a child could understand it, but it's not as overly complicated as Kingdom Hearts 3 is, where even adults don't understand what's going on anymore. The combat system had been greatly sped up to deal with the ever-challenged variety of heartless and nobodies and boss fights that you'll have to face throughout the entire game. There are even more worlds to explore in this game than in any other Kingdom Hearts game, and Sora this time around is far more powerful as a character with the addition of multiple new forms that can increase his combat output without feeling too OP. The RPG elements are just as simple to follow as they were in the first game, the gummy sip sections are still fun to play through, and the soundtrack provides the series with a wonderful set of songs that greatly enhance the overall experience. Kingdom Hearts 2 is just a timeless installment that really shows the franchise at its absolute best, which helps hold its spot on this list. Next on my list goes to my all-time favorite PlayStation 4 game in the form of Persona 5 Royal. This game is the best example on this list of the developers taking the original game, which was not only my introduction to the Persona franchise and not only one of the greatest JRPGs that I'd ever played, but the additions and improvement elevated Persona 5 Royal to becoming one of the greatest video games that I've ever played, supported even more with the reason why JRPGs have remained my favorite genre of games for over 20 years. This addition enhanced exploration, the combat, the RPG elements, brought in an awesome new playable character, and extended the game's story to such a degree that this has one of the greatest endings and final bosses that I've ever experienced in any game ever, with an improved soundtrack that made every extra hour I spent in this game an absolute joy to play. And that's all I need to say as for why this game holds its place on my list. Taking the number 5 spot is the masterpiece that is Resident Evil 4. Now, as someone who was not much of a fan of horror, this game was my introduction to the franchise and became the very first video game I ever played that legitimately scared me. Now, while I consider the combination of tank controls and multiple camera angles from the first generation of Resident Evil games to make those games unplayable, by fixing the camera angle behind the character to the over-the-shoulder, Capcom unknowingly revolutionized not only survival horror games, but action games also. Franchises like Mass Effect, Uncharted, Gears of War, Infamous, Tomb Raider, Evil Within, Dead Space, and many others all use this camera angle. Even after almost 20 years, we are still using it. And when it comes to its story, you take control of Leon S. Kennedy, who is now on a mission to Europe to rescue the president's missing daughter. And instead of fighting off waves of undead zombies, the Las Plagas you face in this game are far smarter and therefore far more dangerous. This game brings back a lot of classic elements from the Resident Evil series while including a number of new ones, and the enemy variety throughout the entire game is my favorite amongst any Resident Evil game, and even the Ashley escort missions add some bit of charm that doesn't really bother me. Even after all these years, this game is still a masterpiece, which is why I feel I'm one of the few individuals out there who's willing to admit that I don't need Capcom to ever want to remake this game, because what changes they do add will probably take away from what makes this game so special. So while I'm willing to give whatever comes out a chance, I have no doubt that it will not come close to how timeless this game is, which is why it holds the number 5 spot on my list. Sticking with survival horror, the next spot is also a masterpiece in the form of Dead Space 2. Now look, I love Resident Evil, but Dead Space is my favorite survival horror franchise of all time. There are only 3 games in the history of gaming that have legitimately scared me, the first being Resident Evil 4, and the second and third being Dead Spaces 1 and 2. And as much as I love Resident Evil 4 and view it also as a masterpiece, Dead Space 2 makes Resident Evil 4 look like crap. It is that much better to me. The Dead Space series is so much more creepier, with a far scarier atmosphere being set on a space station, and adds a psychological element that not any of the Resident Evil games is able to pull off. While the main character in Isaac Clarke didn't say anything in the first game, as the plot was mainly based upon what happens to him, Isaac Clarke this time around feels like a fully realized character with multiple layers, and now having the experience of the first game behind him makes him the one man who's best to deal with this massive threat presented in Dead Space 2. The Necromorphs are the single most terrifying enemy variety that I've ever encountered in any gaming franchise, and the lack of music requires you to focus on the tiniest sound to add a level of suspense and tension that I have not experienced in any other game before. It's the one thing to take elements from one game and improve upon them. It's another to change things up so much that it feels completely original, which is why I was so excited to see this franchise return. And since the remake of the first game is set to come out next year, it already makes it my most anticipated game of 2023. But for Dead Space 2, it stands on the top of my list of being the scariest video game that I've ever played, and 4th on my list of greatest video games that I've ever played. As we continue up my list, we finally get to visit my favorite video game franchise of all time, and this game still remains my favorite PlayStation 3 game of all time in the form of Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots. This game was the very first PlayStation 3 game I ever purchased, and I actually bought this several months before I even owned a PlayStation 3 console. Metal Gear Solid 4 serves as the true conclusion to the main story of the series that spans over almost 60 years across multiple games, and gives an elderly Solid Snake, now going by the codename Old Snake, his final mission. The gameplay style is very unique yet familiar to fans of the series, and the story is perhaps the most emotional entry during the Solid Snake era, at least in my opinion. As complicated as the main story may seem to get at times over the course of the entire franchise, Metal Gear Solid 4 does an incredible job of answering all the questions that have been asked over the series, and brings a satisfying ending to this series, which for many franchises is really difficult to do. The voice acting performances across the board are absolutely incredible. The game will have you travel to multiple different locations, and will even have you revisit one legendary location. The action set pieces are incredible to not only watch through the cinematics, but to take part in during the gameplay. Despite this game's age, the visuals are still really good, and Metal Gear Solid 4 as an overall gaming experience still holds up to me as being one of the best games in its genre, with only one other entry in this franchise standing above it. But holding the number 3 spot I think is pretty impressive, which makes it my 3rd favorite game of all time, and very special to me. Number 2 on my list holds a very special place in my heart, as Final Fantasy X is not only my favorite JRPG game of all time, but I have without question played this game more times than any other game I've ever played in my life. And not only that, I own it on the most amount of different gaming platforms. I first played this game when I was 12 years old, and there are so many aspects of this game that I enjoy almost just about any other game. The story of Tidus being transported 1,000 years to the future to battle Sin alongside Unit and her Guardians is still a compelling story no matter how many times I see it. The legendary Guardian Orin is perhaps my favorite video game character of all time, tied with only one other legendary soldier character in another game. It has my favorite battle system of any JRPG, my favorite cast of characters, my favorite art style, my favorite soundtrack of any video game, and for Final Fantasy, this was for the first game to actually provide voice acting, and while some moments certainly have a level of cringe at times, to me it just adds another element of charms that no other JRPG or heck any other Final Fantasy has been able to replicate. I don't have enough time to really go into detail as for why Final Fantasy X is so special, but just the fact that this is one of the few games that I've ever played that I've enjoyed from childhood to adulthood, and no matter how many times I've played it, I've enjoyed this game just as much now as I did back then, is an extremely difficult task to pull off. But Final Fantasy X pulls that off every single time I revisit this game. And since 2001, I've always made it a tradition to play this game at least one time every single year, and that's something that I don't do with any other video game that I've ever played. Despite all of the positive and praise I give Final Fantasy X, it can only be my second favorite video game of all time, being only slightly edged out by what is, has been, and will always be my favorite video game of all time. Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater will remain my favorite video game of all time till the day I die, but only by a slight margin. Between this and Final Fantasy X, there are certainly multiple elements that each game has a slight advantage over the other, but with Metal Gear Solid 3, it just manages to work a little bit harder to get the slight edge over Final Fantasy X. The story for Metal Gear Solid 3 has you take control of a young big boss going by the codename Naked Snake as he makes his way to Russia to not only destroy a dangerous new weapon, but to battle the legendary Cobra unit led by his own mentor, the boss, known in history as the Mother of the United States Special Forces. Now, while the story for Metal Gear Solid 3 follows a number of story beats and themes that are quite familiar to the series, I believe this game, more than any other in the series, manages to present its fascinating story better than any other entry in the franchise. I find it simply phenomenal that the only two installments in this franchise that are worth being recognized as perfect games to me is the beginning of Big Boss's story and the end of Solid Snake's story, and while everything in between I see as inferior. The stealth gameplay here is my favorite from any game requiring you to change your camouflage to blend into your environments. You will need to keep an eye on your stamina by hunting and eating food along the way and treating your injuries that you will get over the course of the game. The cast of characters across the board are simply iconic, with Big Boss being tied with Auron from Final Fantasy X for the title of being my favorite video game character of all time. The soundtrack is incredible. The voice acting comes across the board as second to none, and it manages to insert some elements of humor to lighten up the tension. But the single element that pushes this game over Final Fantasy X is the ending. Now, while Final Fantasy X's ending is also tragic, you get a pretty good heads up which allows you to prepare for it, and it kinda gets a bit undone in Final Fantasy X too. But Metal Gear Solid 3's story and ending is the only one that has ever been able to successfully break me down emotionally. As an adult, I can openly admit that every time I see the ending to this game, I do end up crying a bit. There's only 2 movies in cinema history as an adult that can break me down like this, but there's only one video game that can do that every single time, and that helps place it above any other video game that I've ever played. The first time I played this game as a teenager, I didn't see any of this coming, and the outcome of this story will have an echoing effect that reaches throughout the entire franchise all the way to Metal Gear Solid 4, a 60-year storyline that started here, and no other game has ever been able to have that much of an impact on the franchise but this game, which is the key reason why Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater will always remain the greatest video game that I've ever played. And I think that'll about do it for my personal ranking of my 14 entries in my legendary 10 out of 10 club. Because, yeah, I hope this video just didn't end up being too long for you. So, again, I hope you guys really enjoyed this video. And instead of asking what you think of my list, I'm more interested in what are some games that you really enjoy? What are some games that you deem imperfect and timeless and enjoy every time you play them? Share your list of games with me and everyone else in the comments down below. And like always, thank you guys for watching. You're awesome, and I'll see you all next time.